Asian dance in particular, and the rich diversity and array of traditions and performance practices were offered from this incredible region that we call South Asia and its whole diaspora. So I first met Pranitha Nair, Pranitha Auntie, when I was a wide-eyed, early 20s person, and had just moved to Chicago to start my PhD. And I will always be so grateful for you bringing me into Chicago's dance scene. I'm a Kathak dancer, and spending so many years and years together backstage, in the wings, on many dance floors, on many workshop floors, and the many things you've introduced me to in the practice of what is called dance in the diaspora. So these are the main points of our panel today and the festival that you've curated. And with that, I'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourself just in a few words, because I will ask you to speak more about your entries into Indian dance. So we'll start with yourself, Pranitha Nair.
Okay, I got the laughs first. Giggles just being with AMEERA. I had done my master's in dance and choreography from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign from 1988 to 1990 years, like 40 years ago or something. And I could never find a soulmate to talk about how the practice of dance moves forward, what influences it, until I met AMEERA. So when I met AMEERA, like, we just talked about how is this moving forward, why is it moving forward, what is influencing it, and that's what connected me to AMEERA and encouraged me to move my own personal practice of dance forward as I began the world of exploring classical Indian dance, its relevance, who's watching it, why are they interested, why are they presenting, South Asian dance. And when in the last 5 years, there's been a large explosion of Indian dance companies throughout USA, and when I look at these wonderful dancers and what are they dabbling in, what do they think about it, what are their influences, and keeping that in mind, I was very excited with the first Mandala Makers Festival in 2018 to start presenting the new voices of dance, of South Asian dance in Chicago through Mandala. Short enough?
Well, I mean, Pranitha Auntie rarely needs an introduction in Chicago.
I know all of that.
So please, Sudeekshna.
Hello, my name is Sudeekshna, and I grew up with my mother as my dance teacher, so I really had no choice in the matter. But it is something that I call the gift I never chose. I grew up with both Bharatanatyam and Carnatic music, so it was an integrated part of my everyday, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, it was everywhere, which I'm very grateful for, because I think it showed me, it continues to show me how it is a lifestyle and not just an art form. So that being said, I think for the longest time, especially with art being taught in the family, I submitted myself to the practices, the routines, the compositions. A lot of this, I just took in whatever came. And it is more recently, as I have become a professional in another way as well. I currently teach in a high school in a 11th grade class that involves special education and biology. So, having delved into the world of education, I think a lot about accessibility. And I think just by virtue of practicing both music and dance of Indian origins in the United States, you do constantly come face to face with questions from other people, and then you tend to internalize those questions. And why are we doing this? What is the purpose behind this, etc. So I think in recent times, my mind has been thinking about how do I reconcile what I do during my day job in education with the arts world. So arts and education is an intersection that I love exploring.
Yes, we'll hopefully talk a little bit more about arts and education, but please, Maya.
Hi everyone, I'm Maya. I'm a Bharatanatyam dancer, a mridangist and a conical artist. I am very passionate about using dance and my art as a medium for social justice. I feel very privileged to have an audience to reach with the arts and a medium to reach that audience, and I hope that I can share stories and narratives that are silenced with that privilege. Like Sudikshana, my mother is also a dancer, and so it was very much a lifestyle for me growing up, and still is my lifestyle. Yeah, thank you.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Warnecke. I'm dance critic for the Chicago Tribune, and I was going to just say that, but since other people elaborated a little bit, I grew up wanting to be a ballerina, but I'm 5'9" and I have hips, so it didn't really work out. So my background is in modern and contemporary dance with ballet training, and I met Renita for the first time in 2017 when she was a Chicago Dance Makers Forum artist making Unwinding. And so it really cracked open these questions for me about classical and contemporary in my own context as well as in the context of Indian dance. And so I'm just delighted to be part of this conversation and hope I can contribute something. Should we make like a little half circle?
Lauren Warnecke is also a writer for the Chicago Tribune and does a lot of reviewing of dance. Reviewing and dance criticism, right? So you all took my first question away, which is how you enter Indian dance. So I might ask a little bit for each of you to talk about, we have a variety of engagements, of migratory patterns through Indian dance on the stage here. Some growing up in India and coming to the U.S. Partway through your careers, some raised in U.S., some, not necessarily having been raised with Indian dance at all. So might we talk a little bit about this term diaspora, if it is meaningful to you, why it is meaningful to you. I'll also add another term in there, which is translocal, and how that might be meaningful to you, and how that works its way into your various entry points into Indian dance as practitioners, teachers, artistic directors, curators, writers, and so forth. We can start maybe in the middle here, Sudikshana.
It's an interesting question to answer. It's not as straightforward as I thought when I think about it more, because for the longest time I think it was aspirational to not be diaspora, especially with traveling regularly to India to perform. Because of various dynamics, I think there was this desire to appear like you were local, translocal. Not even translocal, but just local in India. And the same here. The trans part of that translocal was not something that was it wasn't an active part of the identity, growing up at least. And I think only nowadays for the past few years, been thinking of where is my place in this art form? Because there's so many people who've done the Manakam, there's so many people who want to continue to do the traditional pathway of performance, and that is wonderful. I just have to see that is authentic to me. And I think that's something that, to me, diaspora or translocal is an adjective that I embrace more with time. But I'm trying to find what that means to me still in an authentic way. I don't think I fully defined it.
So my background has been in Bharatanatyam, and I want to acknowledge Anita Veeravali, who's a colleague of almost same age, same numbers of years of practice of Bharatanatyam in Chicago area. She's in Naperville. And Sonali Skandan from New York. We're all practitioners of traditional Bharatanatyam, but I would say that just like there's an English school of ballet, a Russian school of ballet, even in Bharatanatyam there are different schools of Bharatanatyam, and very codified and, you know, hold on strong. So when we say the word Tayum Tatta, Didi Tay, we all know what it is. But it is the physical practice of that Tayum Tatta, how your body is doing it. It differs from school to school, from teacher to teacher, from dancer to dancer. So for me, diaspora is what is happening with Bharatanatyam in East Africa, what is happening with Bharatanatyam in Brazil, in Canada, in England. It is just not my little world of Chicago or Illinois. Bharatanatyam is everywhere, and you know how East Asian dancer performs Bharatanatyam versus a Brazilian dancer. So those thoughts do cross my mind.
Lauren, please.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm thinking about this term in terms of how dance presenters look at diversity and representation of forms. And I think there's a little bit more nuance around how there's an arc of types of representation within some forms, and others are considered like, oh, there's that one thing, we've got that, great. I'm thinking about, this is a little bit of a diversion, but like in music festivals, there's this kind of conversation around how there's oh, they've got one woman on the lineup, so great, we did that, right? And not considering the fact that like various women have various things to say, right? And I think that's very much true in the way that Indian dance can be represented here. I would say in Chicago. I'm not as familiar with other communities in the States or abroad, but that inclusion is one thing, but like representation is another, right? So that's why I'm really grateful for this platform, seeing that there's an availability of more of a multiplicity of voices, I would say.
Yeah, bouncing off as what you were saying about inclusion, I think growing up, I felt more of a need for Bharatanatyam to have this Western acceptance. And so I've been presenting it in Western audiences, and I think one of the terms I used a lot was classical, because I thought that would make them think, oh, this is a classical form, this is a really cool form. This is very, you know, like, worth watching. But I think I realized how much damage that term classical uses to other forms. And also the lack of acknowledgement I had growing up of hereditary dancers of Bharatanatyam. And so as a diaspora dancer, I realized that there are particularly different struggles that we face, but I must still acknowledge the hereditary dancers of our form, the role that caste still plays, even in the diaspora here. And so these are probably more recent questions and things that it shouldn't be recent. I should have been thinking about this all along, but I'm trying to think about more. So yeah, that's one thing. The other is how does my Western influence, for lack of better wording, affect my dance form? And so for me, dance and music are one. Probably like Sudikshana. I'm a percussionist and I'm a dancer, but I view them as the same thing. And for a long time, I felt I had to fit to a certain mold. I felt that, Mridangam had to be one thing. It had to be played in a certain context. I also love rapping, and that's what I did today. But I never really thought that was something that I could meld with anything else I did. And when you start introducing other music forms into your music, that also affects your body movement as well. But I felt that I had to restrict my body movement in certain ways to only fit this mold that would be recognized. Now I'm starting to feel different. I care less about what people think. I rap my heart out. I mix it with konokol, I mix it with mridangam, I mix it with Bharatanatyam. Or my recent production, Steps Beyond Silence. It's talking about the issues I care about, gender-based violence. It's bringing in, it's kind of like a Karnataka Hamilton. It's rap, konokol based. Also, konokol is not seen as front stage either. Konokol is verbal percussion, by the way. It's not seen as a front stage thing. It's always like a side thing that a Mridangist happens to do. And I realized I don't care about these boundaries anymore that have been set to me. There's some boundaries that have been set to me, I feel, from Indian traditions, some boundaries set to me from American traditions, and I think now it's a free for all. I want to do it all.
I really applaud that, and I spoke to everyone here just before the show began, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about some of the things we discussed, and particularly I'll ask Sudikshna and Maya as sort of this next generation of, having received intensive curriculum your whole lives, and now being in leadership positions, right? In the form, in training perhaps children, in training adults, in training, in having academies that you're stepping into, having been raised here. And we talked a little bit about politics. We talked a little bit about accessibility in education, the responsibility of those things. Might I ask, what goes into your making of work? Maybe not necessarily separate from, but intertwined with the movement vocabulary. And I'll ask in particular on issues like you mentioned, politics, history. You mentioned hereditary performers like Devdasis and Bharatanatyam, caste, accessibility, and these kinds of things. What goes into your work? And maybe I'll ask Sudikshna first, and then we'll hear from him.
So, I mentioned earlier that I like the intersection of arts and education. I think that intersects in a few different ways for me. So one is, and I'll give like small anecdotes for each way they intersect in my mind. One is applying arts to education. So I, in the past and now still, work with students who are on the autism spectrum. And there have been situations where, for example, one of my students is nonverbal or has a motor planning delay. And I try to use music as a mode of developing motor control because rhythm occupies the sweet spot between intentional and flow. And so developing motor control was easier when we try to do it through music. And I know that for anyone who's familiar with speech therapy, music can also do that for speech in a way that verbal language alone may not have any intervention methods for. So that's one way I like intersecting arts and education. I also think it works the other way around, so this was applying arts to education. Another way of arts to education is using, for example, music to teach math, so that you don't just know that 4 divided by 2 is 2, but you actually know what the feeling of half is, and that makes it a lot more translatable to apply it. Or dance to teach anatomy. It's much more multi-sensory, multimodal, and learning in multiple ways at the same time. I think there are a lot of inherent skills in the way we practice a sport or the way we practice art that somehow academics doesn't seem to follow that same pattern. I've seen a lot of my students look at the board, write down the notes, and say, oh, I got it, I wrote it down, so I understand it. And then, no, understanding is the next level after repetition, after having generalized it, change up the way you say it, and still recognize the same information. So that is one. And I think bringing education to arts, which is the reverse, is also something I've done for a while now. I used to be part of an organization that worked on building accessibility in the Indian cultural arts. And so that looked at giving people the words that they might not know they needed for things like asking for to be able to read a contract, to know what, to self-advocate, to know your responsibilities and to know your rights within the United States. So I think those are ways that I have been trying to build education into arts and then arts into education.
That's beautiful. I really want to learn more about that, so I'll ask you afterwards. I think that with our generation, we're lucky to have more access to mental health resources and than perhaps our parents' generation might have had. And not just mental health resources, but also resources as to how to like approach students in safe ways. So for example, when I teach dance, it's actually important to consent applies to that too, right? Like you should ask your student before you fix their arm, is it okay? Can I touch your arm and move it? And I think building that language and awareness from a young age, because you have a deep responsibility as an educator, especially dealing with young children, to empower them and also to teach them that like they deserve to be asked that, right? Like they should be asked, is it okay if I fix your arm? Is it okay if I do this? So building practices like that into it. I was working for this nonprofit OnePo around bringing mental health awareness to the South Asian diaspora, and I think that taught me also a lot about how I would want to approach mental health in our class. I mean, these students are often driven in a very competitive, highly stressful environment, and I don't want dance to be something that adds to that competition. And so maybe this is different from other dance schools, but I don't actually encourage my students to go to competitions in the same way, because if they want to, they can, of course, but I try to bring mental health into the conversation and try to make dance as much of a joyful thing for them, something that can give them inner fulfillment, or I hope can give them inner fulfillment in the same way that it gives me. So I mean, these are some ways that I try to, that and also bringing in current issues. I mean, it's lovely to talk about our tradition, it's lovely to talk about our Shiva, Vishnu, you know, like talk about whatever our Hindu mythology is and everything. But right now, our dance school, so I run Anubhava Dance Academy with my mother, and our dance school it's full of many different religions, many different types of people, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, atheist, and I want it to be both accessible and respectful of everybody, and so does my mother. And so that's something we've been thinking a lot about. How can we bring the stories that are relevant to them as well, relevant to everyone as well, and also relevant to what is happening now. Because as Pranita Ji was saying, Bharatanatyam is not just a Chicago thing, not just in New York, but it's everywhere. And it can be used as a language to share so much. And so trying to do what I can with that there.
That's fantastic, and maybe I'll bookmark talking about some of the more fringe voices or categories in the study of South Asian forms. But for a moment, I'd like to switch gears and talk a little bit about Chicago. So, you know, Ranith and I has had a decades-long view of the ecosystem that is South Asian performance here in the city. Lauren, you have had many years of writing about the South Asian dance ecosystem here. What are your thoughts? And I know Sudeekshna also has a presence in the city, so perhaps, what are your thoughts on how this system has changed, how this, to your word, economy has changed, the scene? Where is it right now? Where do you think it's going? And what can we look out for?
Want me to go? Well, maybe I'll give like the top-down view, and then you can kind of go granular. I mean, for me, you know, having grown up in this area, but being very immersed in kind of ballet and modern dance, I think I entered the community through the gateway drug, which is Namche Dance Theater, right? Having a huge presence in the city and a lot of kind of support from the Indian community, both in the west suburbs as well as here. And I think that, to my earlier point, I think that sometimes they have an outsized presence in kind of the larger dance ecosystem. That's not to denigrate their work or any one thing that they're doing, but they tend to have a very kind of classical presentation, I might say. There are other artists who are students of Natya, some who are not, some like Pranita, who have trained up generations of dancers that haven't been affiliated with Natya. And so I kind of see the Indian dance community, from my perspective, as a bit of a pendulum, not between classical and contemporary per se, but between kind of rigorous adherence to the rules and transgression from the rules, if maybe that's one way to put it. Artists who are trained classically, but their work is, and I mean this objectively, unrecognizable in comparison to the classical language or the movement vocabulary. And then, and so they're kind of left in this liminal space where, again, they aren't adhering to very stereotypical, or might I say, white impressions of what Indian dance should look like, and therefore have less access to some of the larger venues and stages that they so greatly deserve. And it also then kind of stifles some of the resources for those experimental projects to come to fruition. That being said, I think that there is growing support for, as I said, a multiplicity of identities and voices and approaches to Indian dance. It's maybe taking longer than everyone would like. And I think that's even happening in the spaces where we might consider those groups or dancers to be more conventionally aligned with a very traditional perspective on Bharatanatyam. So I think I'll just stop there. Oh boy.
It's me. Well, firstly, the ecosystem of Indian dance in Chicago. So thank you to the Richard Driehaus Foundation for funding this festival. We could not have done it without them, for keeping it free, for helping us to make it accessible. We absolutely could not have done it. Point number 2 I'd like to address is Vanita has a flourishing dance school, a very nice dance school in Naperville area. I think Sonali teaches in New York. I did those debuts and Arangetrams till 2016 and 15, and then I just put a hard stop on myself that I'm not going to encourage to do this. Without due respect to you, Vanita and Sonali, it was just sending wrong messages to my students who have this lovely 1 hour on stage funded by their parents, the community coming and supporting them, and what next? How do they get into the professional world where they have to raise their own money, send their own invitations out, get the, and I can speak for Vanita, Sonali and I, and we know like what it has taken, the grit, the patience to put it together, and then to create these new generation of dancers who are just living off as artists, being funded by their families, and they expect the same platform that others have worked so hard to get. Is that in that direction? Plus, I think most of the dancers, whether Indian or Western, I don't even think the number of hours we put into our dance equals to minimum wages. So, yeah, it is labor of love, it's passion, and that's a different conversation, but just coming back to the Indian dance ecosystem and various, we do need a lot of our own community support to encourage independent, strong dancers, not physically strong, mentally strong, but have a platform for them to pull it together.
So, Isha.
I don't know if I can contribute in the same way they both have. I don't feel like I have.
I don't know if I can contribute in the same way you both have. I don't have as much of a bird's eye view as someone who's tried to come up with the system. But what you were saying at the very end is something I can relate to, because a lot of times, having grown up here, trained here, traveled performing, and then decided that I'm going to take up dance music and something else here. You do start at some point realizing that you have to create your own experiences. I think that's something that I'm running into a lot more now, because the platforms don't naturally exist, and that makes sense. Evolutionarily, where it hasn't come yet to a point where there's plenty of dance opportunities that recognize traditional Indian dance forms or traditional Indian music. So I think I'm trying to find ways, that's part of why I'm trying to find ways to and find a niche for myself within the arts and dance experience that others can also relate to. And it's still authentic to me.
Did you want to say something else? I wanted to say that, to kind of bring it back to my experiences in Chicago in particular, you've always been the one to sort of embrace larger, not even just larger than classical, but a sort of multiplicity of what is meant by South Asian dance, by South Asian performance, and by South Asian identity beyond sort of the gravitational pull of Indian performance traditions. I come from a pretty migratory background in India by way of South Africa, Kenya, and Pakistan. And you have all, oh yes, I'm from Toronto. And you've always sort of embraced that as being at the center of what we understand the subcontinent to be. And you've sort of mirrored that in your programming in Chicago. I remember very clearly you bringing sort of a troupe of Canadian dancers to Logan Center and sending your dancers to go study in Kandy. I remember when you encouraged me in particular to look through Urdu poetry and for its dance potential, to look through what have been the kind of, the nexuses of my experience of Muslim identity here in North America. So can you talk a little bit more, and perhaps I open this to everybody else, about how you navigate Indian and South Asian sort of performance practices, what you do with this term classical, how does it still mean to you in your work, and what are the next steps for us to kind of diversify our images of what is dance on a stage?
So one of my favorite memories in my dancing career is from late 1990s to early 2000, where I collaborated with Siona Benjamin. She's an visual artist of Indian Jewish identity in New York. And Ishrat Jahan, who was a Kathak dancer from Bangladesh, and then there was I. Three of us worked collaboratively. We traveled nationally. It was just beautiful. So between Ishrat and I, we danced out the paintings that Siona Benjamin made of stories from the Old Testament, biblical stories from the Old Testament, using classical Indian miniature art as the tool, so the stories were. But it just really saddens me and it breaks my heart that in this current climate, we are just not able to do that. So, same with our program of Diwali, Ram Leela, which I've been doing since 1998, and I currently feel slammed from every direction. The politics of various directions, that it is unacceptable. So that's where I am. Shattered.
Please.
I'll say something about that. I mean, I think that I'll just kind of put my media hat on for a second, and pulling back to the idea of ecosystem and economy. The whole kind of mechanism is broken, and I don't mean to get too dark, but I'm not sure it's quite fixable if we just lean into what it is more. I'll be a little bit more specific about what I mean, but before I do, I would say that the economy of how dance is created, promoted, and propagated isn't working, and it's especially not working for cultural dance forms that do not start in Europe. And that's too bad. So part of the issue of media is that we are hamstrung, and a lot of the funding organizations are still relying on reviews in order to kind of add those reviews to their grant reports, and that's giving them information. And those reviews are, as far as I'm aware, still seen as more valuable than other types of media coverage, like a preview. And reviews are, golly gosh, they're really darn hard to get, aren't they? And on top of it, you have a bunch of aging, broke, white critics who don't know anything about these dance forms. And so what you end up getting is something that lacks nuance at best, and that is offensive at worst. And so I'm not, I have spent my career asking questions about how to make dance criticism better, and training new dance critics to be more receptive and sensitive to different types of dance. But there's just no money. There are no jobs. And so, like you, Pranita, these are entirely people who are passionate about dance, even if they're doing a crap job at it. So once again, I just feel a lot of gratitude for the platform that you offered today, as well as the opportunity to process it with all of you. And I don't want to end my sentence with a downer. So that's yay, this was great. So I think that's what I can add to your thoughts there.
Just to take on your thing about media and writing about dance, it's a long time ago I was educated by another dance critic that a review in a newspaper is equal to buying that amount of ad space in the newspaper. So I feel very rich. I feel very rich in that way. So, yes, to find new stories, new narratives, new ways to break this system.
And you all are, I mean, in so many ways. Perhaps Maya, you can add to that.
So as a director, I'm a director spending probably 60 to 70% of my time applying to grants. And that's difficult, right? I'm an artist. I want to spend time on my dance. I want to spend time on my chronicle. And I'm a full-time artist though, and I have to pay my collaborators. I want to pay my collaborators well. I don't want to be unpaid. I don't want to not pay others. And I think the only way for our form to prosper in this way is if we have like only, if we only, what's the right word? If we only take people's art service with pay, because that sets a precedent. But doing that is hard, right? Because then you end up spending 70% of your time, 60% of your time just applying for grants and applying for grants. And it's not an easy thing to do. And I mean, I think I've been lucky. I've been getting a lot of the grants I'm applying for. But I mean, even this past week, I spent about 25 hours on grant work, right? That's a lot. So, yeah, I would say it is an inhospitable space full of very, very, very passionate people, and I'm thankful for the passion that's there.
Inhospitable space full of hospitable people. So I think part of what I had to ask myself was, what do I want to share? And about this art form, what is it that I'm trying to put out? What is this brand or idea that I'm trying to market, if you will? I think that this is a little bit of a departure from what all three of you have said, but part of having teaching during the day is definitely to try and address the same problem that you're talking about, which is regardless of whether you're a full-time artist or not, that 60% of your time is gone towards the funding of it rather than the actual practice of it. And so I think one way, so there's monetary ways like grants, of course, but I think the other part of it is to build appreciation. Maybe that's building critics who can give the public a sense of standard. Maybe it's grants to build monetary funding. For me, it's education, and surprise. But what I mean by education is, recently one thing I've been trying is to use music and dance as a mode of teaching something else. And that something else is often a soft skill or a people skill. So recently I tried a dance performance called Invisible Threads that was an interactive dance performance working towards building empathy. So there were interactive components intertwined with the dance performances themselves, using the dance as an example of, you can analyze the characters and their characters' relationship and apply that or do an activity that's based on that. Or music, there was a music performance where Building Conviction was the title of that performance, and there's a lot of improvisation involved in Carnatic music, and so using elements of improvisation or elements of Carnatic music to talk about what conviction can mean in a more general sense. So I think those can be more universal ways to appreciate art forms that you didn't realize you actually had an into it. It's just that someone needed to break it down for you. I've heard so many times friends of mine who have learned Carnatic music, who learned Bharatanatyam, wish for someone to sit with them, watch a performance together, and tell them things that they should look for, tell them things that you noticed that maybe they didn't. So whether you have spent years around in this art form or are just finding it today, I think one other way to build that sense of collective experience or shared experience is to break it down for those who you are performing for. Share whatever slice that you
excerpting.
I love that. It kind of reminds me a little bit in how you talk about what you can do through the arts to have other dialogues. And you mentioned a soft skill, but I was recently in a panel that was a Poetry for Palestine panel, and one of the poets who read, she said something that I think I'll never forget, which she said, you know, art making and art are not a replacement for policy change, right? They're not, we need to sort of work on policy change. But through art, we can create and perform worlds that are the ones we don't have, to put into reality on a stage what these alternative worlds can be. And I think we were left with that actually at the end of the show today with Ishami performing this beautiful relationship in a duet, right? A queer relationship. Which I think is that it's that world and performing that world, and it's why I think the arts can be so powerful. So perhaps to your point, Maya, about the inhospitable world, maybe it's apropos that, you know, performance is inhospitable because we're constantly pushing to make these alternative worlds reality, right? So with that, I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions if you have any, and for the performers that are here, if you'd like to add anything, please feel free. But I think there's going to be a mic going around. I can repeat questions if you'd like, but please do ask these amazing panelists here.
Hi, thank you for all your wonderful insights. This is a question for Lauren. I'm Sonali from New York City. Thank you for really mentioning the pitfalls and the challenges of dance critique, especially in the Indian dance context. I've been reviewed many times by the New York Times, and what baffles me, and I think they stopped writing about Indian dance for the most part, because what I think a lot of the Salvation dancers felt is that the critics were not, as you mentioned, knowledgeable. They were not capturing the nuance, or they were not able to write about it in a I would say, Orientalist way, perspective. And so do you see, and you said there's no money in the training aspect, but do you see it changing at all? I mean, as we know, and still, you know, I've been writing grants for 20 plus years now, reviews are important for presenters as well, and not just the grant schema. Do you see it changing? Do you see any kind of initiatives to maybe perhaps educate or?
It's a really complicated question. In terms of full-time jobs as dance critics at newspapers don't exist. There's one person in the country who has one of those. So the short answer is no. But, you know, I would like to think that critics could also be creative people, journalists are creative people. And I think maybe the way forward is in some of these alternative platforms that, some of which are artist-led, and I will die on the hill that artists reviewing artists is riddled with complexity and is in some ways less tangible to a granting organization than quote-unquote, you know, interested third party. And there was a very distinct moment in my career where one of my earliest mentors, Sid Smith, when I first started writing, I was still endeavoring to be an artist at the same time. And he said, you know, you can't do this. Like, you can't be an artist and also review. And I was like, oh, I'll show you, Sid Smith. And then like 5 years later, I was like, oh wait, maybe it gets too weird. Because you can't, you know, it's just riddled with conflicts of interest and all of that. That's not to say that beautiful writing by artists cannot, commenting on other art isn't valuable. And for, you know, in the context that we're speaking of now, might be a way forward. And then hopefully those platforms grab some legs and those writers decide to be writers, right? And I think sometimes, I guess the rub for me is that some dance artists say like, well, I can do it just as good as you and I can also do this other thing that I'm doing. You know, it's sort of like, well, that kind of denigrates the idea that a dance critic is a thing that we dedicate ourselves to being. So I think that there are ways, and it's going to have to be connected to whatever happens and is happening in journalism writ large. Like if we subscribe to the idea that dance criticism is a journalistic practice, then it has to kind of get on board with the necessary transformation of journalism. And part of that includes all of this multiplicity stuff we're talking about, also making sure there are writers who have diverse perspectives. So the rub is like, that sort of uninformed criticism is not happening in ballet and modern because a lot of the critics grew up doing ballet and modern. You know, I think, like Brian Siebert is a notable exception, right? So tap is much more better represented in the Times now that he's there. And one part of what I have tried to do in certain mentorship programs is to ensure there's like people who either have no dance background at all, a blank slate, awesome, that might be the best situation, or have informed practices outside of Euro-American forms so that you get not only informed criticism of Eurocentric forms and watered down criticism of Indian dance, but like watered down criticism of ballet and informed criticism of Indian dance, so that there is this variety of entry points for audience members, right? The last thing I'll say on this is that if critics have agreed to review your show, you know, there's all these rules about how you're not supposed to interview people and you're not supposed to like talk to anybody and you're just supposed to go to the show and go home and then just write what you see. That's very easy if you've been working in the forum that was just presented for 30 years, but if you haven't, you might have to do a little bit of homework. You might have to like sit through some of these panel discussions and like figure some of it out. And you know, I hope that there's a platform in the future that allows writers the luxury of being able to invest that kind of time. So I hope that gets like part of the way for you.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Shilpa Mridul. I'm just visiting, and I don't have a question, but just a few observations if I can do that. Firstly, I'd just like to thank Pranita for having me here, really inviting me to this fantastic day. I've seen a lot of these workshops and performances back in India, and I have to tell you one thing, that each performance that I've seen today is par excellence. I mean, I didn't even imagine that somewhere out of India, people could be performing just as what we had seen there. I mean, excellent is the word. I also want to go back to the workshop that I attended both in the morning, Maya, as well as Sutikshna. Yeah, Sutikshna's. Very, very well done, and very happy to attend them. And I also like to tell Sutikshna, see, I'm basically a therapist and an artist, but I also practice theatre. And I love the Abhinav thing that you did, and how you brought the context and your mom with you, and it was so beautifully worked out, you know. I wish people would teach like this. I really hats off to that. And also what you just brought up just now, where you talked about your dance and bringing soft skills into it, and you know, putting in empathy. What a great way to reach the audience, which brings me back to what I've heard of Pranita, that she's been doing Bharatanatyam for a long time, but trying to contemporize it. And whatever I've heard y'all in the discussion, I can see the pain of all of you wanting to really bring up something here, and I feel so proud as a citizen of India that here are, you know, friends who are really doing so well for us. So I want to thank each one of you today, and thank you for having me here.
So I do want to address, Sonali, your question about reviews equivalent to grants. I mean, we are here because we are funded and able to bring you. And I don't think that's always true. It has not always been true in my case. It's a lot of checking off other boxes, the data, they're then coming to take a look at you. And so, and to your case about dance critics, I find them a lot more educated now in global dance forms than I did 10 years or 15 years ago. So I understand it's a slow process, and both sides have to meet someplace. And I have to be able to explain myself to you, and you have to understand where I'm coming from. It just can't be you didn't understand, you don't get me.
I was thinking about the same thing because a lot of times in the educator world, there's research that goes around that says when students see a teacher that they can relate to, maybe they look like them, maybe they sound like them, maybe there's some shared identity there, they tend to do a lot better, which again, surprise. But that means that there needs to be a representation in the educator body. So how do we get representation in the educator body? I am actually one of maybe 2 South Asian teachers in my entire district, mostly white, and few East Asian teachers. So, but there is a high population of South Asian identifying students. So you work backwards, and like, how do we get representation in the teacher body? And you say, well, okay, then more people should want to be a teacher. How do you make more people want to be a teacher? You need to have good teacher training facilities that market. And how do you market? Okay, then you need to make teaching itself seem like a desirable job to have. How do you do that? So you kind of work backwards, and you at some point realize that behind all these funding and all these training programs that go on is somebody who cares. And of course, funding is needed, or care is needed at various levels. So you need good teacher training programs. You need people who have that ability to give. But where I think is one place worth looking is school systems funding, because arts, when a parent or a family realizes that arts is actually a very holistic way to teach so many things, I think school systems are one good way to start building awareness, and also including more arts programs in school systems. At least since I'm in that sector, I think of that often. But I think that's perhaps one way to build both awareness and the resources for it at the same time.
Yeah, we had a question up front. Thank you.
I really enjoyed, not just today, but in the past, the variety of artists Pranita that Mandala Arts has brought to stages and other venues in Chicago. It's always a pleasure to kind of check in with what you're watching and who you are connecting with and choosing to elevate for Chicago audience. It's really appreciated. My question is for anyone on stage who's working with young people as an educator, and that can either be in a dance practice, a studio environment, or in an academic context. The question sort of applies both ways, but I would just be curious to hear anything relatively recently that a younger person has said or done that surprised you in terms of how the quote-unquote classical or traditional practices are landing with the next generation? Is there anything sort of unexpected or delightful or challenging about what a young person how they've responded to the content in the work, the traditions surrounding the work, that sort of thing? I'd just love to hear any examples that come to mind. Thank you.
You saw the smile on my face. in one of my music classes, so a quick context. One of the aspects of Carnatic music is singing a scheme, a note scheme, kind of extemporaneously. And this involves just non-rhythmic phrases. And so I was trying to get a student acquainted with this particular note scheme. And I was trying to approach it in a observe first and then dive in way. And I let them open-ended question. I said, how does this sound to you? And then the student embarked on this very vivid description. It's a ragam. Ragam is the name of the note scheme, if you will. And this ragam sounds like a buoyant beach ball on a sunny day in July. And and they went on to describe how they play with that beach ball and you try to submerge it here and it comes up, and it was an entire screenplay. I did not expect that. But it was particularly delightful not just because of that wonderful summer screenplay that this child described, but the way she went on to apply it. I was particularly surprised. I mean, you give this open space assuming that, if you do it, this child will do something that will surprise you. And you know that they will surprise you theoretically, but when it actually happens, it still blows your mind. And she's able to recognize patterns in this, note patterns in the ragam or in this note scheme, was able to justify how this particular phrase sounds like her throwing the beach ball to a friend across a pond. And it was quite, I think, when it actually happens, it hits you in a way that just makes you want to step back and watch. And do nothing but actually just watch. So that was
I'm experienced both with very little ones and very old ones. So the very little ones, this lovely Devi Durga piece that Sonali did about the Devi, with the skulls around her neck and the trident killing the demons, and my very young one said, "So what a great Halloween story." And so, okay, I can deal with that. I have mentored many older students, and I think I continue to mentor, just not as dancers, but as professionals, as practitioners of dance, and they find it very tiring. They're very tired by it. I mean, the biggest lesson they take, it's not easy coming.
So I think that there's in our Indian traditions, there's a lot of reverence for those who are older than us, and while I think that is well placed and it's important, sometimes it can happen to a degree that we don't question things that we should question, traditions that are discriminatory, problematic. And I really like what Sudikshna said, because she was talking about how she was observing. And I think one thing that I'm trying to work on is, I know myself, but as I deal with very young children, is giving them also the respect that they deserve. And one thing I've noticed is when you give them that respect, they act as if they deserve that respect, and I love that. So that is one thing I've noticed. I instead of just scolding them, I let them ask questions. I ask them questions. I ask them, what do they want to do? What do they learn from this? What is the story they want to tell? With the little kids, we actually have story time at the end of every class, and they act it out. They tell their own stories, and I just appreciate that. I think I'm thankful that my mother has a very similar line of thought as to I do, so I think I grew up with that privilege, and I think just as we have respect for the elderly, there should be respect for the younger generation too. Yeah.
I think we have time for one last question if anyone has one. Okay. I'd like to thank all of you, Lauren, Maya, Sudeksha, Pranita, and thank you all for being here, for engaging with us, and thank you for putting on a fantastic performance. To all the performers, you really animate a new world of tomorrow, so thank you